When you play the Game of Thrones, you
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright, hello YouTube, and welcome back to the Grease Goblin YouTube channel. Today's video, we are going to be doing a breakdown of the Red Wedding chapter. Now, in my opinion, this is the greatest chapter within the entire story. I talked about it in my top 10 A Song of Ice and Fire chapters last week, so if you want to see kind of my more reasoning for why, I'm also going to talk about it in this video, but if you want to see that video, it'll be out there. You can watch that if you'd like. But before we get into the video, if you guys like to like, subscribe, and comment, please do. It helps channel reach other people that might like this content as well. And let's get into it. So this chapter kind of starts with Catelyn at the wedding. And she, right off the bat, kind of notices the drums, how loud they are, how kind of awful the music is. She can't even really tell what song they're trying to play. She goes back and forth between it could either be Alysanne or The Bear and the Maiden Fair. We're not sure. She doesn't know completely in this situation, but she just knows that that's what they're trying to do. So right off the bat, we know that these musicians are not the best and could be more to them, which we end up knowing that they're not probably real musicians, and they end up, start shooting arrows and stuff. But yeah. Now, the next thing that we hear is that really they're packed in this wedding, right? There's a ton of people in here. It's really hot. And that Catelyn has been placed between Ryman Frey and Roose Bolton. Now, what's interesting is the initial plan for the Freys with Catelyn is they actually wanted to keep her prisoner. That was the plan. The plan was never to kill Catelyn. It was to kind of imprison her and use her kind of as a bargaining chip and all that. So it's interesting that she gets placed between these two, kind of just to kind of control her when the chaos breaks out and stuff like that. But yeah, that ended up not happening, as we will see. Now, the next thing we notice is that Ryman Frey is just going ham on the drinks right now. Like, you can tell the man is sweating. He's getting to the point where he might be drunk. And you can definitely tell he's nervous. When you're rereading these chapters, you understand that Ryman Frey, he knows what's about to happen, and he is nervous as hell. And Roose Bolton, kind of being this cold, calculated person we know that he is, not eating much, and also not drinking much either, which kind of a sign that, Roose Bolton doesn't really want to eat much, doesn't want to drink much to keep him, where he would be drunk or something like that when you're about to do this big old elaborate plan to have the Red Wedding. And we continue on, and we know that Robb, right, is, having a pretty good time. Although that this feast is not great for a king, it's actually quite poor, as Catelyn describes it, and makes a lot of sense why Lord Frey would want to do this. It's not like he actually is having a big wedding to get these two together and all that stuff. This is really just a big mummer's farce, right? This is just to get Robb here and then kill them. So it makes sense why this is a kind of a poor kind of meal, but even Lady Catelyn really doesn't really raise any red flags at this point. It's just, hey, it's the Freys. It makes sense. And then we also see that Robb has been there was something that was said to him by Lord Frey that, hey, I hope you dance with all my daughters and stuff like that. So Robb has been making his rounds and doing all the dancing while this wedding feast is going on and all that. And Edmure's having a good time with his wife, he's exchanging kisses and stuff. But something very interesting that Catelyn notices in this chapter is that Rosalind Frey kind of has this fixed look to her, where it seems like she almost has a look painted on her face, where she's really hiding a lot of what's going on in her head and her emotions and stuff like that. And again, we know why, because Rosalind Frey knows what's about to happen, as well as she's about to have her bedding. There's just a lot going through her mind at this point, and it's something that is very difficult for a young woman to be going through at this point of her life. Now, the next thing we notice in this chapter is that Walder Frey was definitely not stingy on the alcohol, with wine, mead, all that type of stuff was definitely at this wedding. So it's very interesting that Walder Frey, from an outsider's point of view, right, if you're looking at this from Catelyn's point of view, he wasn't stingy on any of that stuff, but he's stingy on the food. It should be something that, again, raises a major red flag, but doesn't really with anyone there, right? Because what Walder Frey is trying to do is get all these people drunk, right? Like the great John Umber, who is someone that, if he's intoxicated, would be a lot easier to take down and imprison. And we also hear that Roose Bolton has decided to marry Lady Walda Frey. And he does this more or less because she's the heaviest person there, the fattest one there, because Walder Frey said, hey, if you take one of them, I'll give you, their silver in their weight, right? And she's a big woman, so Roose Bolton says, I'll take the money. And very cold person, again, as we see with Roose Bolton, and that he really doesn't find a lot of enjoyment in his life as well. Someone kind of like Stannis in that regard. But, yeah. And the weirdest thing is that, Bolton does this toast where he says, two of your grandsons are, in the Dreadfort. And Catelyn kind of takes this as this is a threat to Walder Frey, the way Walder Frey reacts to this toast. And in a way, it probably actually was, right? This was something where it's like Roose goes, you better not back out of this, Walder Frey, or you better not turn on me in this wedding. And that's kind of what I got out of this from what Roose Bolton is doing here. And he's a very calculated person. So I think that's exactly what Roose was doing in this toast. What I think is really interesting that comes next, that follows up this kind of talking about Roose Bolton and his future wife, is that Catelyn kind of references that this is a very joyless wedding, right? Maybe for her, others definitely not, but for her, this is a very joyless wedding. And she kind of goes into deep thought, thinking about how Sansa had to be married with Tyrion and how horrible that would have to be. And instead of marching south to kind of rescue Sansa, they were actually marching north. And what is really interesting, again, is even more foreshadowing from George that something bad is going to happen, that she talks about it's more of a relief to have Robb going north and to be out of the twins and trying to take Moat Catelyn than it would be to actually be at this wedding. And that is saying a lot. And it also kind of goes to the point of what Robb has always been, is that Robb is very good with a military mind and tactically sound, that in warfare, Catelyn feels a lot safer about his kind of security and all that. But when it comes to things like political stuff and all that, she very much knows he's not very good at it. She herself is not very good at it as well, but she's better than Robb in most cases. So it kind of shows you what Robb's story has really been up to this point. Someone that has won every battle, but is going to lose the inevitable war. And to me, what I believe is the most damning evidence that the Red Wedding is going to happen and something is just going wrong, and kind of continues to feed this eerie feeling that was built in the chapter before. If you've not watched that video, I think it's a very good prelude to this video, that there's this eerie feeling here. And Walder Frey is someone that is very calculated, again, knows what he's doing politically, and Catelyn kind of knows this. She just doesn't know to what extent Walder will go. And Walder Frey, before the wedding starts, kind of goes to Robb and goes, Grey Wind is not going to be at this feast, right? He's not going to be in here. He needs to be, somewhere else, chained up or whatever, because he's already, basically almost attacked the Freys at his gates and has been just acting up since they've been there. Now, for Robb, this kind of makes sense, right? That he wouldn't want Grey Wind there because, there would be children at this wedding feast. There would be, Rosalind would be there, women would be there. And it kind of makes sense when you look at it from Robb's perspective of why Walder wouldn't want Grey Wind there. But Robb kind of tries to fight this, saying, hey, the wolf will listen to me, it'll be fine. And Walder Frey just goes, you might be king in the north, but you are not, this is my house. These are my rules. You're under my house. You will have either the wedding or you won't have Grey Wind there, right? Or you'll have Grey Wind there. You guys know what I meant. And again, it's another great idea from Walder Frey to separate Robb from his wolf. Because when this all happens, you do not want a dire wolf running through on this wedding feast, just ripping people's throats open. So again, great maneuver here from Walder Frey to kind of eliminate extra threats that can make this whole thing go wrong. And from now on here on, this is where it just starts to go very poorly. As we see Roose Bolton kind of whispers in, something and then leaves to go to what Catelyn believes is the privy, which we know is not the case, and when he comes back, it's going to be far worse. But for now, Catelyn doesn't really see anything wrong with this. Roose Bolton ends up leaving, and Robb sits down. Now, Robb sits down and kind of starts going to Catelyn, kind of almost talking to us as the reader, saying, you know, what, this is almost over, and soon we'll be heading to the north. And what I think is very interesting is that Robb then goes to Ryman, Frey, who is sitting next to Catelyn, and goes, you know, is Oliver Frey here? I'd hope to see him. You know, I would ask him to squire for me once again. He was someone very loyal to Robb, and we heard this in multiple chapters before this. And Ryman Frey goes, no, he won't be here. He's off doing other stuff. Now, this is the second Frey that has not added a major Frey wedding that is probably the best match they've ever had in the history of their house. At this point, there should be so many red flags going off in your head to where, what? That makes no sense. And it seems as though with every Frey that was kind to Robb or liked Robb is not here. So again, major red flags, and George continuously giving us hints and foreshadowing that something is wrong here and something is going to happen. And now what we see gets even more interesting is after this interaction with Robb and Ryman, Robb ends up, you know, going to do a dance with, you know, one of the Mormonts, Daisy Mormont, I believe, and Ryman Frey also decides to leave. Now, what I think is interesting in this is that neither one is near Catelyn when this all starts going down, because, again, they wanted to actually keep Catelyn a prisoner. So I think it's interesting that they didn't have someone instantly capture Catelyn, and both of kind of the people that were next to her end up leaving. And again, another red flag. Right? Two people that we know are probably not trustworthy at this point now leave the wedding feast, or the hall at the very least. And Robb starts having this dance, and Walder Frey kind of claps his hands and says, should we bed Rosalind and Edmure? And of course, Robb is like, yeah, let's bed them and all that. And we see some of these characters, right, start to kind of do the bedding ceremony where, you know, the great John picks up Rosalind and starts to escort her out, and Edmure kind of with the Frey ladies kind of gets taken out as well. And what I think is what maybe Walder Frey had thought was that Catelyn would go with her brother. Now, Catelyn in her own mind was like, she probably should be there, but she probably didn't want to spoil the fun for Edmure and all that. Who would want, you know, her, you know, his own sister doing this? And it made sense for why she stays, but I think in Walder Frey's mind and Roose Bolton's mind as well, that I think they thought Catelyn would probably go for this bedding ceremony. She does not, and we see what will continue to play out. And another thing I want to point out before we start getting into the main part of the Red Wedding is that, again, Rosalind Frey is crying. She is almost in terror as she's being taken out of the hall. And it's this mix of emotion that we know, as someone that knows what's about to happen, that she understands what's about to happen, as well as she's about to be, you know, about to lose her virginity and all that stuff. A lot's going through her mind, but it's, again, something that we should be, again, taking on, because George continuously keeps remarking about Rosalind being kind of upset or not really being happy at any point of this, where she seems very fixed in her facial expressions, like she's trying to put on a performance. And that's kind of what we get. Now, as all these people leave the hall, we see that there aren't that many people really left in this hall. We see that Catelyn and Daisy Mormont are the last two kind of left in the hall, and Daisy Mormont actually decides to ask Edwin Frey for a dance. Or actually, it's said that, like, you know, she whispers in his ear or whatever, but we know that she asked him for a dance. And he kind of responds with, no, I'm done with dancing for the night, which is very weird, just based upon the tone of how he does it and how he kind of rejects her in that way, which is very off-putting. And even Wendell Manderly is going, is there something wrong? Like, that's just very unusual behavior. And this is where it all starts to click for Catelyn. Right? Catelyn goes, what is going on? What just happened there? Why would that happen? And she starts to kind of walk towards Edwin Frey, because Edwin Frey starts to kind of walk away and starts to go towards the doors. And this is when the entire chapter changes. We've been having this eerie feeling, this buildup of just something is amiss, something is not quite right. And George kind of building up this kind of hope that, oh, we're just going to go north and reconquer the north and all that. And this is when it all comes crashing down. As Catelyn rushes to Edwin Frey, they start playing The Reigns of Castamere, a song very much with the Lannisters. And that's when I think it starts to click in Catelyn's mind that something's not right. And as she goes to kind of grab Edwin Frey, she realizes he has on chainmail. And that's where you're like, why would he have on chainmail? And then Edwin Frey continues and he shoves her aside. Now Robb going, why did you just shove my mother? And kind of angrily starts to push towards them. We see the first kind of arrow loosened and it hits Robb. So Catelyn kind of sees Robb and he takes an arrow or a quarrel through the shoulder and then also through the leg. Now Robb just taking this, he goes down instantly, and Catelyn almost is just too in shock to even understand what's going on. She thinks maybe Robb might have shouted or something like that, but she doesn't know. She can't, hear anything. And the impending slaughter continues from this moment. And we see that half of these musicians now have crossbows and stuff like that, and just start unloading on the kind of Robb's loyal people below. We see the small John Umber try to protect Robb by placing a table over him. And we just see the brutal slaughter that starts to go on as we see, multiple characters being, killed, whether that be with swords or with, quarrels or arrows coming in. And Daisy Mormont tries to go for the door. And when she does that, Ryman Frey comes in fully clad with, axes and stuff with other Frey soldiers. And Daisy Mormont is killed as an axe goes right through her stomach. But this is where we get our first kind of, hey, maybe there's, a chance for rescue, right? And we see that Catelyn notices that through other doors, there are northern men coming through. And she's like, okay, maybe for a split second that, this is their rescue. The northern men see what's going on, and they're going to come rescue everyone. And even you as a reader, you're thinking, okay, Robb and Catelyn can't die like this. There's no way. And these northern men turn out to be Roose Bolton's men, and your hope just slowly dies. With this being said, the northern men kill small John Umber. They lop his head off, specifically. And Catelyn just sees a dagger or a knife that had fallen, and she thinks that she will kill Walder Frey because he's just sitting up at the table watching this, laughing almost. And Catelyn thinks that she can maybe get Robb out of here, or maybe end this with Walder Frey dying, and she kind of goes for the dagger. And as this is being kind of thought up in Catelyn's mind, we also hear that there's distant battle going on, and we also hear a wolf. We hear Greywind in the distance, and we know, that Catelyn kind of thinks, oh, shit, right? Greywind's still, chained up and all that, and Robb is out here kind of dying and all that, but we see one last kind of effort from Robb as he struggles out from underneath this table small John Umber had placed over him, and kind of gets to his knee and struggles to kind of stand. Now, Walder Frey, being kind of a prick, and at this point, and kind of liking what he's done, goes, the king in the north arises. It seems as though we've killed some of your men. Don't worry, I'll make an apology. And it's one of those things where it's very Lord Walder Frey kind of talk, and mocking him on his deathbed at this point, because he's already taken 2 pretty big injuries. And Catelyn, at this point, makes her move. She grabs Jingle Bell and kind of holds him at dagger point right over his throat and goes, Lord Walder Frey. And in one last-ditch attempt, Catelyn goes, enough, this needs to end, right? The betrayal has been paid for. If you let us go, we will forget everything that's happened here, and we will seek no vengeance. And Lord Walder Frey, being smart, just knows this is not true, right? There's no reason to let them go. At this point, he's already gone too far. He has to finish what he does. He can't just let Robb and Catelyn go. It just doesn't make any sense. And Catelyn kind of at this last point she's kind of begging, really, for her last boy's life and her oldest child to be spared at this point. She doesn't really care about herself. She cares about Robb. And when you're looking at all of her children at this point, she believes they're either all dead or in the hands of kind of enemies and in hostile places, living horrible lives like Sansa. And Arya, she doesn't really know about. She believes Bran and Rickon are dead. So in her eyes, this is just the end of almost her house in general. So it's her really just trying to plea for Robb and for her child. And she even kind of begs, saying, Walder, take me and maybe even Edmure as hostages if you must, if you haven't killed him already, and let Robb go. And Robb at this point, still being alive and kind of standing at this point, goes to his mother and says no. And, Catelyn kind of says, walk out, right? If not for me, then for Jane. And Robb, after this, kind of goes, Jane, and kind of in a question like type of tone. And then also his last words are Grey Wind, right? And this is where the theory of Robb kind of going into Grey Wind kind of comes from. And it's one of the leading reasons why I think a lot of people believe that Jon is going to warg into Ghost in Winds of Winter, as he has died, and that is how he's going to come back. Now, I think it's very interesting, the idea that Grey Wind kind of has Robb's spirit, if anything, or mind, and that Robb actually lives on for a few more seconds until he's eventually killed again. But it's really tragic the way this whole scene ends, right? Because Catelyn is just saying, yes, leave, go, get out of here, just go somewhere that's not here. And we, of course, know that that's not going to happen. What follows is Walder Frey saying, why would I let him leave? Like, why would I do that? And Catelyn, kind of thinking there's some hope maybe left, kind of says, because I have jingle bells or whatever, and that I will trade a son for a son's life. And Walder Frey, as snippy as ever, goes, he's just a grandson, and he's really never been much use to me, which again fits Walder Frey's personality fantastically. And this is really the end of Robb Stark, as a sword goes through Robb's heart, and basically the words are uttered, Jaime Lannister sends his regards. And we know this to be Roose. And this is just one of those things where it really paints Lady Stoneheart and why she inevitably seeks vengeance and stuff when Catelyn comes back and all that stuff. And this is the last thing she hears, and why she wants revenge on Jaime, because it's something that it makes Jaime seem like he was involved in this and knew what was going on and all that stuff after she had released him. So it's a really good tie-in to what we see with Lady Stoneheart. And Catelyn is just broken by this. Watching Robb die breaks her. And it almost looks like her face, just with the tears going on and the blood and all that, it seems like she's going mad. And the Freys, who originally were going to keep her as a captive to be traded in eventually and all that stuff, end up slicing Catelyn's throat. And something that we'll come back to in the story with Lady Stoneheart, she can't talk because it's cut so rough. And that's kind of how the chapter ends, with Catelyn really dying and thinking about Ned right before she dies, and ending one of the biggest POV characters in the books, and one of the main characters in Robb, the person that was supposed to get revenge and all that stuff for Ned. And again, George, in my opinion, had been building to this chapter for nearly pretty much 3 books at this point. And this, to me, is the climax of the entire story. It's where everything gets overhauled. We go from a state of war to a state of peace and kind of ruling. And this is definitely the climax for me, as I believe the rest of the story is kind of the falling action and then the resolution. but it shows that George is still not afraid to kill main characters, and he never really was. And it's just one of those things where you look back and you read the story and you understand why this happened. At a first time reading, you'll be sitting here like, how did this happen? Why did this happen? But in reality, all the signs were there. As I've talked about in this chapter, how I talked about in the yesterday's video in that chapter, even with Arya's chapter, in the chapter in between these two chapters that I've talked about in the last two videos, there is a lot that foreshadows this happening and a lot of eerie feeling going into this chapter. So when you look at it from that point of view, this really is, to me, the perfect chapter in A Song of Ice and Fire. It takes everything that is good about A Song of Ice and Fire and puts it into one chapter. The foreshadowing, the political maneuvering going on in the background with Bruce Bolton in the phrase, and the backstabbing, the kind of talking of war and strategy and what's going to happen after this, and the payoff of the Red Wedding, all of this kind of collides into one perfectly cemented chapter that really, if anything, if you look at the show, is what made the show that kind of episode as itself. And for the books, they'd already been great at this point, but this was the point that, to me, really hooked me onto the books. As tragic as it was, Robb is one of my favorite characters. It made me want to see what was going to happen. Were we ever going to get justice for characters like Ned? What was going to happen after this? Because the War of the Five Kings ends with Robb, really. I mean, Stannis is still alive, but he does not have a lot of power right now. Robb still had a lot of power to him, but just not that much to really oppose the Lannisters and Tyrells. So it was really interesting to kind of see where that story was going to go, and George definitely continues with the big time chapters in this book. And yeah, so thank you guys all for watching. I hope you guys like this video. If you guys like to see me do other chapter reviews, let me know, and I will see you guys all in the next video. Bye, guys.
If you think this has a happy ending, you haven't been paying attention.